Under the saturated lights of the Pine Hollow County Fair, everything felt larger than life, especially for 16-year-old Hannah Prescott. She moved through the noise with a kind of easy electric confidence that made her hard to miss. That night was the last Saturday of August, and the fairgrounds were bloated with people, laughter spilling from every ride, the smell of funnel cakes in the air, and the echo of pop music rattling from the grandstand speakers. Hannah had spent most of the evening with her friends near the stage, waiting for the last act to wrap up. They shared sodas, took photos under neon signs, and promised to meet again before school started. Everything seemed normal, joyful even. But just after 10:15 p.m., when the crowd began to thin and vendors started closing down, Hannah vanished. No one noticed at first. Her friends assumed she'd left early with someone else or gotten a ride from her older cousin. It wasn't until they tried calling her that the first red flag appeared. Her phone went straight to voicemail. By midnight, when she still hadn't checked in with her parents, concern turned to panic. Hannah was responsible. She wasn't the kind to leave without saying anything. Her mother paced the living room, calling every contact in Hannah's phone. Her father drove through the back roads around the fairgrounds, headlights sweeping empty fields and wooded patches. By 2 a.m., they reported her missing. Deputies from the county sheriff's department arrived by sunrise, but it was already too late for a clean search. The fairground had been trampled by thousands of feet, littered with confetti, and packed up by vendors who were already heading to their next stops across the state. By then, almost 12 hours had passed since Hannah was last seen. The officers interviewed ride operators and food stall workers, most of whom had already moved on. The only consistent account placed Hannah around the grandstand stage between 9:30 and 10 p.m., talking with a small group before wandering off alone. Without any signs of struggle or clear evidence of a crime, deputies hesitated to call it an abduction. The word they used was runaway, a term that stung, especially for her parents, who insisted it didn't fit. Hannah had left behind her purse, her house key, even the jacket she always carried. Still, the initial tone of the investigation was casual. They checked local bus stations, watched her social media for activity, and waited. It was a wait that would last days. It wasn't until Monday afternoon that something shifted. A volunteer combing the far edge of the fairground, the overflow area behind the food trucks, noticed something half buried in gravel and trash. It was a phone. The case was bright teal, cracked down the back, and unmistakably Hannah's. Deputies examined it on site. It was powered off, not dead, just turned off. Her lock screen still displayed the time it had last been active, 10:22 p.m. Saturday, less than 10 minutes after she was last seen. That discovery changed everything. It was no longer a teenage whim or an impulsive escape. It was deliberate, calculated. Her phone had been switched off and discarded in a place she never would have gone alone. The area behind the vendor stalls was dimly lit and largely empty by nightfall, with delivery trucks and makeshift storage units lining the shadows, the kind of place no fairgoer had reason to wander through unless they were being led or chased. Suddenly, the search intensified. Deputies taped off the surrounding area and brought in dogs. The bloodhounds caught a scent trail for a short distance, then lost it near a rusted utility fence that backed into the woods. But the terrain was already compromised by foot traffic and vehicle treads. Nothing definitive could be pulled. Surveillance footage from nearby booths was either missing or blurry, and none of the food vendors had security cameras facing the alley behind them. Still, something about the discovery of her phone unsettled the investigators. Whoever placed it there knew what they were doing. They didn't smash it, didn't leave it in plain sight. It had been tucked just far enough under debris to require a sharp eye to find, as if whoever left it wanted to erase her trail, but not completely. It left more questions than answers. Why take her phone and turn it off? Why not just destroy it? And why behind that specific section of the fairgrounds, far from any exits or parking? For Hannah's parents, the moment the phone was found marked the point where hope cracked and dread began to seep in. They held a press conference on the courthouse steps, asking for tips, pleading for whoever had seen something, anything, to come forward. The story made local news, flyers went up, but no new leads followed. Her case sat in limbo. A girl who was there one moment and then not. The crowd had swallowed her whole, and for now all that remained was silence and a phone, dead and buried in the dirt, pointing toward something far darker, waiting just out of sight. By the third day of Hannah Prescott's disappearance, the Pine Hollow County Sheriff's Department could no longer treat it as a possible runaway. Too much time had passed without a single confirmed sighting, and the discovery of her phone behind the vendor stalls changed the entire tone of the investigation. Sheriff Clay Moran called in state resources, and by midweek, the case had shifted from missing juvenile to suspected abduction. That change brought helicopters, dogs, drones, and volunteers from surrounding counties, but it also brought the weight of something darker, a growing realization that someone may have taken her, and no one knew why. The first sweep began at sunrise the following morning. Volunteers in orange vests walked shoulder to shoulder through surrounding farmland, thick woods, and drainage ditches. Deputies worked in coordinated grids, marking off every shed, barn, and structure within a 10-mile radius of the fairgrounds. A dive team was deployed to scan a nearby retention pond, while others probed culverts with long metal poles. Yet for all the manpower and media presence, the land remained silent. There were no pieces of clothing, no signs of a struggle, no blood trails, nothing that pointed to where Hannah had gone. K-9 units brought in from the state police picked up a fresh trail using one of Hannah's sweatshirts from home. The scent led them to a gravel lot near the rear of the fairgrounds, not far from where her phone had been found. From there, the dogs grew excited, pulling their handlers toward an old maintenance building once used for electrical storage. The structure was rusted, largely forgotten, and kept behind a sagging chain-link fence. Inside, the dogs grew more agitated, circling a narrow door that led to a cramped stairwell descending into darkness. Deputies pried open the rusted lock and descended. The tunnel beneath the fairgrounds was not on any recent blueprint. Built decades ago as part of an electrical upgrade, it had long since been decommissioned. Its walls were lined with corroded pipes, its air thick with mildew. Flashlights skimmed across graffiti, empty beer cans, and signs of squatters, but no indication that Hannah had been there recently. Still, the bloodhounds stopped just before a gated corridor, noses pressed to the ground. The scent ended at a rusted utility gate. Beyond it, only collapsed concrete and blocked access. She had been there, briefly, but whatever trail existed had gone cold. With the tunnel now a central focus, investigators began canvassing the area above ground. They pulled maintenance logs, entry rosters, even subcontractor schedules from the week of the fair. Dozens of temporary workers had been hired, carnival crews, food vendors, stagehands, electricians. Most were already gone following the fair's circuit. Some were contacted by phone, others had left no real trace. The sheriff's office circulated flyers to other counties along the carnival route, hoping someone might recall seeing Hannah or someone acting suspiciously. Nothing came back. In parallel, the department quietly ran background checks on every person affiliated with the fair that week. Local sex offenders were re-interviewed. Known predators were asked for alibis. One vendor was flagged due to a past assault conviction, but he had already been verified as working across the fairgrounds at the time Hannah vanished. Another stagehand was questioned after an anonymous tip about creepy behavior, but nothing substantial could be tied to him. Each lead fell apart within days. Hannah's parents, once private and reserved, stepped into the spotlight. They sat for interviews, went live on local stations, held vigils, and joined the search teams themselves. Her mother, Dana, clutched one of Hannah's stuffed animals during a televised press conference, pleading with whoever took her daughter to just let her go. Her voice cracked as she described the last words they shared, something about bringing back kettle corn and staying near the stage. Her father, Mark, remained more subdued, more guarded. He stood beside his wife, expression blank, jaw tight. Every day without word made him sink deeper into silence. The fairgrounds became both sacred ground and open wound. Even after the rides were dismantled and vendors cleared out, investigators continued combing every square foot. Metal detectors were swept across the soil. Drainage grates were lifted. A team of cadaver dogs brought in from out of state rechecked the surrounding brush, woods, and trails. But still, nothing. No body, no articles of clothing, no confirmed witnesses. It was as if she had walked into the shadows and been swallowed whole. Weeks turned into months. The sheriff's department kept the case active, but priorities shifted as other emergencies pulled attention. The dedicated task force was quietly reduced. Reporters moved on. Online theories began to spiral. Some claimed the fair was a cover for trafficking. Others believed she'd been taken by someone she knew. A few held on to hope that she had run away and was living quietly somewhere else. But none of it fit. Her room remained untouched, still filled with posters and notebooks, with a sweater folded on the edge of the bed. The Prescott home was no longer a place of comfort. It was a monument to absence. Her parents kept her phone sealed in an evidence bag in the kitchen drawer, the last item they'd ever get back. It offered no answers, only a timestamp and a silence that had now stretched for months. In the end, the search that began with hope devolved into ritual. Every potential lead ended with nothing. Every late-night phone call brought only more waiting. And the truth began to settle like dust over everything. Someone had taken Hannah from the heart of a crowded fair and left not even a footprint behind. In the vacuum left behind by vanishing answers, the internet did what it always does. It began filling in the gaps. In the weeks after the official search efforts dwindled and news coverage faded, online forums became the epicenter of speculation. Reddit threads dissected every confirmed movement Hannah had made that night. Facebook groups were formed by amateur sleuths convinced the local police had missed something. TikTok surfaced with timelines, location maps, and voiceovers filled with ominous music. And like most digital investigations, theory bled into fiction fast. Some believed she had run away. Maybe she'd met someone online, planned her escape quietly, and used the chaos of the fair as cover. It would explain the lack of struggle, the silence, the dead ends. One post claimed she had been seen on a Greyhound bus 2 towns over. That lead fizzled within hours. Others pointed fingers at the carnival workers, transient, mostly cash-paid employees who came in and out without leaving much of a trail. A few had criminal records. One had vanished himself shortly after the fair ended. His name was passed around in comments and Discord servers like an open secret. But background checks and phone records later showed he'd moved out of state to care for his sick mother. He had nothing to do with Hannah. Then came a more unsettling rumor. A girl from Hannah's school, someone she'd had history with but hadn't spoken to much that year, posted something cryptic online. She claimed Hannah had been acting strange in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, that she'd mentioned someone following her, watching her, not in a paranoid way, but casually, like it had been happening for a while and she didn't want to make a big deal of it. The girl described Hannah receiving anonymous notes in her locker. One allegedly said, "See you at the fair." When detectives followed up, the story began to shift. The girl admitted she never saw any notes herself, just heard about them from a friend of a friend. No formal complaints were ever filed. No messages were found on Hannah's phone. The school had no record of any reported harassment or stalking. It became one of many leads that began with promise and collapsed under scrutiny. But the rumor lingered. Other whispers painted a more accidental picture, that maybe she'd walked in on something, a drug deal behind the vendor stalls, a fight, something that made her a target, that she hadn't been taken for who she was, but for what she saw. That possibility rattled her father, Mark, who began requesting old vendor placement maps and security access logs. He asked for blueprints of the fairground utilities. He started showing up at the sheriff's office with red string theories and annotated aerial photos. Deputies began treating him with quiet pity. It was the beginning of a shift, when the case transformed from an active search to a lingering tragedy. By the start of winter, Hannah's case was no longer a lead story. Coverage faded into passing mentions. The sheriff's office reduced its task force down to a single part-time investigator. The posters started curling at the corners. Tips slowed to a trickle. At school, her locker remained untouched for months until administration eventually cleaned it out. Her name was whispered in hallways, usually followed by theories that were more rumor than remembrance. The emotional toll was brutal. Her mother, Dana, struggled to balance public hope with private despair. She made television appearances, took interviews on podcasts, and read every comment under every article. At home, she slept in short bursts and woke to nightmares. Mark grew increasingly withdrawn. He stopped going to work altogether and poured his time into rewatching footage from that night, hoping a flicker of movement or a shadow might give something away. Every frame became sacred, and every frame failed him. The fair committee made their decision by spring. Despite the tragedy, they would move forward with the next season. Vendors returned, rides were reassembled, the grandstand stage was restained, and a fresh coat of paint covered the maintenance door. No plaque, no sign, no mention of the girl who'd vanished a year before. The only visible change was an extra floodlight installed near the rear fence and a temporary security guard positioned by the utility sheds. For show, more than protection. When summer returned to Pine Hollow, it did so unchanged. The air still smelled like grease and cotton candy. The laughter returned. So did the music. But something underneath all of it felt wrong, like a wound was being ignored. Dinah didn't attend the fair. Mark showed up, alone, and stood at the edge of the grounds for hours. He watched the stage, the vendor rows, the same gravel lot where her phone had been found. No one noticed him. He didn't speak to anyone. Then he left. The fair rolled on. The town adjusted. People moved forward the way people always do when the world doesn't stop for someone else's loss. But for the Prescotts, and for those who remembered that night in 2017, Hannah didn't just vanish. She was still there, somewhere, not in the physical sense, but in the silence between rumors, in the space between theories, in the way everyone seemed to talk about her like she was gone, but no one could say why. Grief doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in slowly, taking up space in the walls, the routines, the conversations that stop before they finish. For the Prescotts, the absence of Hannah became a presence in itself, constant, deafening, and unspeakable. The first few months had been filled with noise, press conferences, interviews, search parties, updates from the sheriff's department. But when the case cooled and the media turned away, that noise faded. What remained was the quiet and the unraveling. Dana Prescott wasn't ready to let go, not of hope, not of visibility. If the sheriff's department was losing interest, she would make sure the world didn't. She agreed to every daytime interview and true crime podcast, appearing in glossy magazine spreads and late-night segments, always with Hannah's school portrait pinned to her sweater. She consulted psychics, first in private, then on live television. One medium claimed Hannah's spirit was trapped near water. Another insisted she was alive, being held somewhere underground. Dana didn't care about the contradictions. She clung to them all. To her, believing in something was better than the stillness of believing in nothing. She started attending conventions for missing persons. She passed out flyers at rest stops 2 states away. She lit a candle in the window every night and refused to change the bedsheets in Hannah's room. They still smelled like her shampoo. She would say that out loud sometimes to people who didn't know how to respond, people who stopped coming around as often, friends, neighbors, even family. The support that had flooded in during those first few weeks was drying up, replaced by awkward silences and polite avoidance. The tragedy had stretched too long. People didn't know what to do with it anymore. Mark Prescott chose a different path. He stopped talking to reporters, stopped answering calls from well-meaning strangers. He pulled away from friends and quietly took an extended leave from his job at the Department of Public Works. In the garage, he set up a folding table with copies of every blueprint, staff roster, and utility layout related to the Fairgrounds from the past 20 years. He pinned maps to the walls, highlighted names on employee logs. He marked sections of the Fairgrounds with red stickers, places where the soil had never been disturbed, areas where concrete had been poured too quickly, sections that had been closed to the public but accessible to staff. He built timelines, where Hannah had been, when vendors packed up, how long it would take to drag someone from one side of the fair to another unnoticed. He requested satellite images from the day she vanished, analyzing shadows, vehicle placements, crowd formations. Every night, he sat at that table with a cup of cold coffee, circling numbers, making lists of names, cross-referencing worker IDs with out-of-state offenses. He believed the answer was buried, literally. That beneath the stage, or under the gravel lots, or inside some sealed storage crawl space, something was waiting to be found. Dana tried to talk him out of it at first. She begged him to stop fixating on things he couldn't control. But Mark had already passed the threshold where reason could reach him. He spoke in fragments about outdated permits, about a drainage tunnel no longer on file, about a former electrician who used a fake name. None of it ever led anywhere, and every dead end only made him dig deeper. By the 1-year mark, the two of them were living in separate rooms. They didn't fight loudly. They just stopped sharing space. They passed each other in the hallway without speaking, ate meals at different times, grieved in completely different languages. Donna blamed the sheriff's office for giving up. Mark blamed everyone. He said it beneath his breath, at the news, at the neighbors who stopped asking questions, at the people who looked away when he walked into the grocery store. He stopped attending vigils. Donna continued going alone. The sheriff's department, too, was changing. Detective Greg Winslow, who had led the case since the beginning, retired quietly after 32 years on the force. He hadn't solved the case. He hadn't even come close. When asked at his retirement party about Hannah Prescott, he gave a tired sigh and said only, "I still think about that girl every day." The case was reassigned, but not with the same urgency. It was now in the hands of a younger officer with no prior experience with long-term missing persons. The file sat thick and heavy in a drawer, rarely pulled. At the department, Hannah's name was mentioned less and less. Once a daily briefing topic, it now only came up when someone called in a false tip or when the anniversary date approached. The case wasn't closed, but it might as well have been. In Pine Hollow, life adjusted. New missing persons cases came and went. New fairs were held. New headlines dominated the front pages. And through it all, the Prescotts drifted further from each other, each trapped in their own version of grief. Donna, in the public search for meaning. Mark, in the private hunt for proof. They loved their daughter. They both still believed she was out there, but the pain of not knowing had metastasized into something else, something sharp, isolating, and permanent. And in the middle of it all was a silence they couldn't break. A silence that stretched from the dinner table to the empty bedroom upstairs. From the garage filled with blueprints to the unused voicemail on a dead phone. A silence that felt like the only thing left of their daughter, and the only thing keeping them apart. 8 years is long enough for most people to forget. Long enough for names to fade, for posters to peel from telephone poles, for stories to turn into something softer, less real, more rumor. In Pine Hollow, Hannah Prescott became something between memory and myth. A face on the community board near the post office. A photograph in the back hallway of the high school. Her name was still spoken, occasionally, but with a kind of cautious distance, like people weren't sure whether to say it with hope or grief. Most just avoided saying it at all. The fair never stopped. Every August, like clockwork, the rides returned. The booths lit up. The stage came alive. The same layout, the same vendors, the same music blaring from cheap speakers. Nothing visibly changed. But beneath the surface, the energy had shifted. That section behind the food stalls, the one where her phone had been found, was still used for storage, but staff always moved quickly through it, as if the air there felt different. And the grandstand, where she'd been seen last, remained exactly as it was, a sun-warped wooden stage with rusted supports and soft spots underfoot. It hosted talent shows, country bands, and dance performances just like before. But no one could stand on it without thinking about the girl who vanished nearby. Even if they didn't say it out loud. Dana Prescott couldn't take it anymore. By the 4th year, she sold the house, said she needed to breathe different air. She moved to Kansas, into a quiet suburb where no one asked about her daughter. She stopped giving interviews, stopped returning calls from amateur sleuths and late-night documentary producers. She left behind the candle in the window, the psychic visits, the vigils. Grief doesn't always go away. Sometimes it just exhausts you. Mark stayed. The house grew quieter, smaller somehow. Dust settled into corners. The fridge stayed mostly empty. He no longer kept the maps spread across the garage like a war room. But he didn't stop going to the fair. Every single year, on opening night, he showed up, alone. He carried the same notepad he'd used since the beginning. Walked the grounds slowly, observed, took notes on new vendors, changed routes, staffing patterns. He'd photograph tire tracks behind the booths, measure distances between the stage and maintenance access doors. He never spoke to anyone, never disrupted the event. But the regular staff came to recognize him. They called him The dad. No one tried to make him leave. He never said what he was looking for. Maybe he didn't know anymore. Maybe it wasn't about finding something. Maybe it was about not letting the place forget what had happened. Over time, Hannah's name became a warning told in low tones to new workers. Don't walk alone behind the food trucks at night. Don't linger near the old stairwell by the power shed. Yet, there were stories. A fairground haunting, some said. Others insisted she'd been taken by someone who still worked the circuit, that her ghost walked the gravel lot, barefoot and silent. They were just stories. But they kept the fear alive in a way the case file couldn't. Then came the announcement no one expected. By year 8, Pine Hollow's budget committee finally secured grant money for long overdue infrastructure improvements. The fairgrounds had gone too long without renovation. Safety concerns, electrical issues, and unstable construction were adding up. And most importantly, the stage, the very same grandstand that had hosted performances for decades, was slated for full demolition and rebuild. The foundation would be torn out, the support structures excavated. A new concrete slab would replace the weathered wood. It was sold to the public as a modernization effort, but behind closed doors, county officials admitted it was also about optics. That old stage had become too closely tied to a memory no one liked revisiting. Mark heard about it from a city council agenda posted online. He read the meeting minutes twice, then printed them out. He circled the date of the demolition in red ink and taped it to the refrigerator door. He didn't tell anyone. Not Dana. Not his neighbors. He just waited. The renovation project was set for early spring, long before the next fair would arrive. A local construction company was hired. Permits were filed. Equipment was staged near the lot by March. On paper, it was just another improvement effort, another update to aging infrastructure. But for Mark Prescott, it was something else entirely. He knew every inch of that fairground, knew what had never been checked, what had never been disturbed, and for years he'd insisted, quietly to himself, that the answer wasn't somewhere far away, that it had been under their feet all along. It was a Thursday morning in early March when the demolition crew arrived. The sky hung low and gray, the air still sharp with leftover winter. Pine Hollow's fairgrounds looked deserted, stripped of their usual joy, just empty concession trailers and faded signage flapping in the wind. But at the edge of the property, where the grandstand had stood for decades, yellow equipment lined up like sentinels. A small team from a local contractor was tasked with dismantling the old stage and clearing the foundation for new concrete. Most assumed it would be quick work. Pull up the boards, level the dirt, move on. But by mid-morning, that changed. It started with one of the workers, Cody Felton, prying up a warped section of floorboards near the rear support beam. As he drove his crowbar into the joists, he noticed the ground underneath didn't feel right. It was softer than expected. Hollow, maybe. He removed another plank, then another, until a strange pocket of space began to emerge. It wasn't listed on the renovation blueprints. No crawl space, no utility chamber, no known structure below that portion of the stage. Just darkness and packed earth that had clearly been undisturbed for years. Cody knelt down and used a flashlight to peer in. What he saw made his skin crawl. Less than 2 feet beneath the surface, partially covered by soil and insulation debris, was a thick layer of plastic tarp. Old, dirty. Frayed at the edges like it had once been blue but had since faded to a ghostly gray. A corner of it had curled away, revealing what looked like fabric, shredded, moldy, pressed tightly against something pale beneath it. He backed away, called his supervisor, and within 20 minutes the site was taped off. The sheriff's office was contacted. Deputies arrived with shovels and latex gloves, working with slow precision. And by late afternoon, the discovery was no longer just a rumor. Beneath the stage, wrapped in plastic and dirt, were human remains. The body had long since decomposed. Forensics later confirmed what everyone in Pine Hollow already suspected. It was Hannah Prescott. The skeleton was curled in on itself, fetal-like, as if the body had been stuffed into the cavity and left there to vanish. Mixed in with the remains were fragments of decayed clothing, the hem of denim shorts, pieces of what appeared to be a faded maroon hoodie, both consistent with what she'd last been seen wearing. Around her neck, still barely clinging to bone, was a necklace her mother later identified as Hannah's, the one with a tiny silver star charm, a birthday gift from the year before she vanished. But it wasn't just the body. Next to her bones tangled in the rotted tarp were two other items that instantly escalated the situation. The first was a rusted bolt cutter, heavy and corroded but still intact. The second was an employee lanyard with a cracked plastic ID sleeve. The photo inside was so water-damaged it was barely visible, but what was immediately obvious was the name, Martin Kessler. A name that didn't appear on any official staff roster from the 2017 fair. The moment that ID was recovered, the case shifted violently. What had once been a local mystery returned as a front-page story. The sheriff's department held a press conference within 24 hours. Forensic anthropologists were called in from out of state. The FBI renewed their involvement. Reporters camped outside the fairgrounds. The town buzzed with a mix of outrage and vindication, particularly those who had believed all along that the fairgrounds held the key. Dana Prescott returned to Pine Hollow the following day. She didn't speak to reporters, she didn't go near the site. She met with the sheriff privately and later told friends that she felt hollow, like every version of grief she'd rehearsed had collapsed into something she wasn't prepared for. Relief and devastation tangled. Mark, for his part, stood outside the caution tape as investigators worked. He didn't speak, didn't cry. He just watched. He had always believed it, that Hannah never left that place, that they had built rides and stages in celebration over the very ground that had hidden her. The town struggled to process what it meant. The fairground was shut down indefinitely. Construction was halted, events were canceled, candlelight vigils returned, this time with no ambiguity. People left flowers and drawings and apologies at the base of the chain-link fence. A local newspaper ran the headline, "She was here the whole time." And quietly, in the sheriff's office, they opened the case file again. Not from the beginning, but from the bones. The bolt cutter. The badge. And the question everyone had feared to ask. Who was Martin Kessler, and why had his ID been buried beside Hannah Prescott? The name didn't mean much at first, Martin Kessler, a generic enough identity, printed on a faded county fair staff badge, found buried next to Hannah Prescott's remains. But it wasn't on any official record, not in the volunteer logs, not in vendor contracts, not in any of the subcontractor schedules tied to the 2017 Pine Hollow Fair. And yet, someone with that name had been there, close enough to bury a girl beneath the stage without anyone noticing. Investigators had made mistakes before, but this was something worse, a ghost in the system. Someone who'd slipped through quietly, deliberately. Detectives began with the obvious, temporary labor agencies used during the fair circuit. The electrical contractor assigned to the fairgrounds in 2017 had cycled through dozens of short-term hires, stage riggers, lighting techs, maintenance workers. Most were part of the traveling fair circuit, moving from county to county with equipment trucks and cash pay. No W-2s, no benefits. Few left any digital footprint. But the name Martin Kessler surfaced in a faded handwritten sign-in sheet from a third-party staffing vendor. Just one entry. No address, no phone number, no background check on file. Just a signature and a timestamp. Aug 23, 2017, stage electrical setup. From there, the trail darkened. No official records tied to the name existed in county employment rolls. But federal systems eventually pulled up a sparse trail. Martin Kessler had used that name, and variations of it, across several states over the past decade. A half-dozen employment stints, all short, none longer than 2 months, mostly listed as independent electrical or maintenance labor. Always with minimal personal information. He worked in Arkansas in 2015, Oklahoma in 2016, Illinois briefly in early 2017. Pine Hollow was one of his last known locations. After Hannah Prescott's disappearance, he seemed to vanish too. That coincidence couldn't be ignored. What little could be uncovered about his early life raised even more alarms. The Social Security number used to fill out one of his earlier 1099s matched a juvenile record sealed by the state of Missouri. No specifics were accessible, but one detective described the seal level as Class A violent offense. Not a minor infraction, something serious, something buried, and it wasn't his only red flag. He'd used a fake address on at least 2 employment forms. One rental residence listed as his own had been abandoned for years. The more investigators dug, the more Kessler unraveled, not as a man, but as a paper-thin identity stitched together just enough to keep moving. Then came the dead end. In late April, 2 months after Hannah's remains were found, detectives tracked down a fire report from Franklin County, Indiana. It detailed a warehouse blaze in the spring of 2019, an abandoned structure that had burned to the ground overnight. A body was found inside, badly charred, but enough dental evidence remained to confirm the name: Martin Kessler. It wasn't an accident. Investigators had noted accelerant patterns consistent with arson. No clear cause was determined, and the case was closed without prosecution. At the time, it was treated as either a suicide or an accidental blaze by a transient occupant. Now, it looked different. When the autopsy was re-examined, small but telling details emerged. Kessler had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of the skull before the fire. Not fatal, but enough to incapacitate. It raised a possibility the local police hadn't considered back then, that someone had discovered who he really was and silenced him before he could disappear again. But if Kessler had killed Hannah, why would he keep the badge? Why bury her where she could be found? And if someone else had killed him, who? And why wait 2 years? Detectives tried to piece together his movements after the fair. Old motel receipts, gas station surveillance, burner phones bought in cash. None of it gave them what they needed. He had lived like a shadow, always just out of reach. Former co-workers remembered him vaguely. Quiet, older than the usual guys they worked with, always wearing gloves even in the heat. Never drank with the crew. One remembered a strange smell about him. Another said he once saw him sketching something obsessively in a notebook. No one ever knew where he slept. He just showed up and disappeared. Pine Hollow reeled again. This time, not from grief, but from the realization that for years, a man like that had walked among them unnoticed. The thought that he'd returned each season, maybe working under a different name, maybe standing feet from children and families, rewrote the entire story. He wasn't just a suspect, he was a phantom. And now, he was dead, taking with him any hope of confession or clarity. The discovery offered some answers, but birthed a dozen more. And as the investigation turned its attention toward understanding how he did it and why he chose Hannah, there was one thread left dangling. Who let Martin Kessler in? Because someone had. Someone had hired him, and someone had turned the other way. Long after the press conferences faded and the headlines shifted to newer tragedies, a quieter investigation kept going behind the scenes. One focused not just on who had taken Hannah Prescott, but how. If Martin Kessler had buried her beneath the stage without detection, the logistics of that act had to be surgically precise. The stage was the centerpiece of the Pine Hollow Fair. Hundreds of people moved around it that night. The ground was uneven, but not soft enough to dig by hand. And yet, somehow, he'd managed to make her vanish, hide her body in a concealed space, and leave no one the wiser. It was too clean, too impossible, until they found the tunnel. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, an intern working at the county building department. She'd been tasked with digitizing old property records when she stumbled across structural plans from the late 1970s. They showed a narrow crawl space running beneath the Fairgrounds stage, originally built to house power lines and emergency backup wiring for lighting and sound. The crawl space had been listed as decommissioned in 1984, after an electrical overhaul rendered it obsolete. According to county paperwork, it was supposed to have been sealed and filled with concrete. It wasn't. A ground-penetrating radar scan of the Fairgrounds, ordered during the forensic sweep after Hannah's body was discovered, revealed an irregular void beneath the southeast corner of the stage. Investigators returned to the site. Under the remaining support beams, barely accessible through a half-rotted panel of wood, was a tight, low-ceilinged crawl space. It stretched about 10 feet inward, ending in a shallow concrete wall. The air inside was stagnant. Dust clung to every surface, but it wasn't empty. What remained inside was decades-old wiring, rusted tools, and the unmistakable signs of recent disturbance: a boot print pressed into the dirt, a faded cloth glove, and an empty water bottle manufactured in 2017. Investigators called in forensic engineers. The analysis confirmed what they already suspected. The crawlspace had never been properly sealed. The documents had either been falsified or forgotten. For over 3 decades, the tunnel had remained accessible to anyone who knew it was there. And Kessler, somehow, had known. They went back to security logs from the week of the fair. Vendor check-ins, janitorial access, stage crew rotations. Kessler wasn't officially listed, but subcontractor punch records showed a gap in oversight between 8:30 p.m. and 11:00 p.m. on the night Hannah disappeared. The entire lighting and sound crew had been on break during the final musical act, a time when Kessler had been seen roaming near the back of the stage with a coil of extension cables slung over his shoulder. He had the perfect cover, a worker fixing lights, a trusted presence, just another man in a badge with a job to do. Using forensic mapping and eyewitness statements, the FBI built a digital reconstruction of the fairgrounds as they had been that night. In the simulation, Hannah's last known location, chatting with friends near the grandstand, was less than 30 yards from the hidden tunnel entrance. Kessler had ample opportunity to approach, and if he told her there was a short or a problem backstage, something simple he needed help with, she might have followed without hesitation. Especially if he pretended to know someone she knew, especially if he made her feel useful. Inside that cramped space, no one could hear a scream. The music would have drowned everything. People were cheering. Fireworks had gone off minutes earlier. The entire fair was vibrating with distraction. The working theory grew clearer. Kessler had likely prepared the site days in advance, cleared the space, laid the tarp, brought in tools. He didn't bury her. He stored her. He used a forgotten tunnel as a hidden chamber, knowing it wouldn't be checked. He left no trace outside because he never took her outside. It explained everything. The lack of drag marks, the missing surveillance footage, the abrupt end to the scent trail near the fence. She hadn't been moved. She'd been there the whole time. It also explained the bolt cutter. Investigators believe Hannah may have been locked inside, that Kessler closed off the narrow entrance with a temporary padlock or makeshift barrier, then left. The bolt cutter, found near her remains, might not have been his. It might have been hers, something she found inside the crawl space, maybe days later, maybe too late. The theory was gut-wrenching, that she'd survived for a period, tried to escape, and ultimately succumbed to heat, dehydration, or injury before anyone ever thought to look beneath their feet. The crawl space became sacred ground, taped off, documented, preserved. In retrospect, the clues had been there. Mark Prescott had even mentioned the possibility of underground spaces in his garage blueprints years earlier, but no one had taken it seriously. Now those old papers were re-examined, every detail underlined and cataloged. It was all there, hidden, overlooked. The question that remained was whether Kessler had used that tunnel before. Had he chosen that fairground because of it, or had he simply discovered it by accident and seen the opportunity? No one knew. But what they did know, what they finally proved, was that Hannah Prescott hadn't wandered off. She hadn't been taken far. She hadn't vanished into the night. She had been lured, trapped, and hidden, just a few steps away from the lights and the noise and the people who might have saved her. And for 8 years, the fair had danced above her grave. The evidence told a story more devastating than anyone was prepared to hear. Forensics teams combed every inch of the hidden crawlspace beneath the old grandstand. What they found wasn't just human remains, it was the physical record of Hannah's final hours. It began with scratch marks, dozens of them. Some shallow, others deep. Most clustered along a corroded metal panel just inside the wall near where the tarp had been laid. Investigators used portable lights and high-resolution imaging to analyze them, and the patterns were clear, small, narrow grooves made by fingernails. They were frantic, uneven, overlapping. Some had dried tissue embedded in the rust, an agonizing confirmation that Hannah hadn't died instantly. She'd fought, she'd tried to escape. DNA swabs confirmed it. The samples matched her perfectly. There was no other biological material in the area, no sign of a struggle with Kessler inside the tunnel, which meant she'd likely been trapped alone, with no one responding to her cries, just inches beneath the celebration overhead. When the autopsy report came back, it clarified what little the bones could still say. The cause of death wasn't conclusively listed. After 8 years, soft tissue was long gone, but there was evidence of trauma. A fracture to the right parietal bone, likely from blunt force impact, not consistent with a fall, more consistent with being struck, either by a tool or in a desperate attempt to break free. She may have tried to force her way out. She may have succeeded in loosening something until it collapsed or struck back. Either way, she hadn't simply been left to die. She died fighting. Then came the bolt cutter. It was heavily rusted but still recognizable. Forensics matched its make and model to a discontinued repair kit used during stage installations back in the early 2000s. That particular kit had been kept in a small maintenance shed behind the performance area, locked but rarely inventoried. When the shed was finally opened during the investigation, only a few dust-covered tools remained. The bolt cutter was missing. Detectives now believe Kessler had taken it before or during the fair, stashing it in the crawl space in case he needed it, or worse, to give Hannah the illusion of escape. But they also considered another possibility, that she found it on her own, maybe after being left behind, that she'd tried using it to break through the panel or unhook a barrier. There were rust smears on the wall near the scratch marks. An impact point, evidence she'd swung the tool with enough force to crack metal. It painted a brutal image, a 16-year-old girl, alone, in the dark, swinging a bolt cutter at a rusted wall, inching toward escape, until the injury stopped her. The emotional toll of that revelation hit hardest at home. Mark Prescott, who had clung for years to the belief that his daughter had been taken and killed quickly, now sat with the unbearable truth that she'd survived, at least for a time, that she'd been close enough to hear the music. Close enough that someone might have heard her if they'd only known where to listen. Dana couldn't bring herself to read the report. Her friends had to relay the findings slowly, carefully. Even then, it shattered her. There had been hope in the unknown. Now, the truth left no room for mercy. But the final piece came from somewhere entirely unexpected, a dusty storage unit 2 towns over. Following a trail of old employment records, detectives tracked down a self-storage facility where Kessler had rented a unit under an alias in 2018. The locker had been inactive since his death in the 2019 warehouse fire. When investigators arrived, the contents hadn't been touched in years. Inside were tools, wires, scraps of stage rigging, and a battered filing box. What they found in that box pulled the entire case into sharp, unbearable focus. It was filled with sketches, dozens of them, folded and stained, drawn in pen and pencil on legal paper. Diagrams of the Pine Hollow Fairgrounds, angles of the stage, measurements from the back fence to the vendor rows, handwritten notes marked with dates and observations, lighting crew breaks when 1930, back gate loose, drainage crawl space, uncharted. Some pages had names on them. Hannah's was there, written 3 times, underlined once. Others appeared to be possible targets. Teenage girls, first names only, ages, descriptions of clothing, hair. It was methodical, cold, a blueprint for something calculated and long in the making. Kessler hadn't stumbled upon Hannah. He'd chosen her, watched her, tracked her, and he'd done it with the patience of someone who knew exactly how to disappear afterward. There were no journals, no confessions. No explanations, just sketches, plans, evidence of obsession. Investigators couldn't prove if he'd ever acted before. No confirmed link tied him to other disappearances. But the tone of the locker was undeniable. It wasn't his first thought. It might not have been his first attempt, but it had been his first success, at least in Pine Hollow. The discoveries reframed the entire case. This wasn't just about a murder. It was about a predator who had moved through the town unnoticed, who had studied the infrastructure, who knew the weaknesses in the system and exploited them. Hannah had been a target, and her final moments weren't stolen quickly in the dark. They were prolonged, trapped, desperate. Her body had been buried. So had the truth. But now, finally, both were beginning to surface. The truth didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces, jagged and unwelcome, each discovery cutting deeper than the last. By the time the investigation closed for good, the full portrait of Martin Kessler had taken shape. He wasn't just a drifter or a subcontractor who slipped through cracks. He was a predator. one who had spent years building a life around invisibility. Temporary addresses, short-term jobs, no digital trail, just enough paperwork to get hired, just enough silence to go unnoticed. His name changed a few times, his story adjusted at will, but his pattern never did. What investigators eventually pieced together from employment records, surveillance footage, and the contents of that storage locker was horrifying in its simplicity. Kessler had worked the Pine Hollow Fair circuit before, at least twice in the years leading up to 2017. He wasn't assigned directly to the stage crew, but often volunteered to assist with lighting or audio setup. It gave him access to areas the public couldn't reach. It let him blend in, and more importantly, it gave him time to observe. Witnesses, mostly younger fair volunteers, remembered a quiet older man who stayed on the edges, polite but detached, not overly friendly, just another face behind a lanyard. No one remembered his name, no one questioned his presence. He had watched Hannah for days. From what they could tell, Kessler had tracked her movements, where she and her friends gathered, how she looped around from the food stalls to the stage, where she tended to linger when the crowds got loud. Her photos were found in his storage unit, scribbled times next to them, an arrow pointing from the vendor row to the southeast corner of the grandstand. He'd chosen the night of the final performance for a reason. Peak attendance, peak chaos, lights, music, fireworks, all the noise in the world to drown out a scream. The working theory is chilling in its efficiency. Kessler likely approached her around 10 p.m. wearing a badge, carrying cords, appearing stressed. He might have asked for help, just a quick hand with a wire backstage, a light not working, a microphone shorted, something benign, something that wouldn't trigger alarm. He led her toward the corner panel of the stage, already loosened, where the crawl space lay hidden beneath. Once she stepped inside, there was no way out. What happened next can only be constructed from evidence: the tarp, the bolt cutter, the fingernail scratches, the fracture in her skull. Whether he struck her in panic or to subdue her is unknown. But what is clear is that he sealed her in and left. That night, he clocked out like nothing had happened, packed his things, disappeared. From there, he vanished into the underworld of temp work: Arizona, Louisiana, Indiana. Each state left a faint mark. The jobs grew shorter, his movements more erratic. The last confirmed location was the warehouse in Franklin County, abandoned, off-grid. He'd been living inside, alone. Investigators now believe he knew the net was closing. Whether he planned to take his life or was killed remains debated. But the fire was no accident, and with it, the last living witness to what happened under that stage was gone. Pine Hollow grieved all over again. But this time, it was different. This time, they had an ending. In the weeks after the final report was released, Hannah's remains were returned to her family. A funeral was held, 8 years late, but no less raw. The church overflowed. Old friends spoke, their voices shaking under the weight of time. Her bedroom was finally emptied. The candle in the window, long since burned out, wasn't replaced. Dinah and Mark stood together, not healed, but no longer split by the unknown. And then came the demolition. The town voted unanimously to remove the fairground stage entirely. No rebuild, no replacement. The land where it once stood was leveled and left bare. Grass was planted and a single memorial stone placed at the edge. It read simply, Hannah Prescott, 2001-2017, never forgotten. It wasn't a shrine, just a quiet reminder of what had been lost and what had been hidden in plain sight. The fair returned a year later, smaller, with fewer lights. The stage was gone. The laughter was softer. There were still rides, still music. But beneath it all, a kind of reverence lingered, as if the land itself had changed. In the end, the mystery that haunted Pine Hollow wasn't solved by a sudden clue or a late-night confession. It was unraveled through time, persistence, and quiet truths buried beneath years of assumption. Martin Kessler had taken a life and nearly erased it, but he hadn't succeeded. Not completely. Hannah had been found. Her name restored, her story reclaimed. The silence was broken. The ground no longer carried her secret. And though the horror of what had been done would never leave the town entirely, it no longer owned it. The ghost was gone. The haunting had ended.